Looks like everybody's here, Jim. You about ready to start?
Yeah, Tech. All set to talk about troubleshooting the Powerflite automatic transmission on this Chrysler. I've asked Don and Lefty here to work with me on this Chrysler unit so they'd get acquainted with the adjusting procedures.
That same transmission is also used on the Dodge and DeSoto, isn't it?
Yeah, and the checking and adjusting procedures are almost the same for all three makes. There's some variation in clearance and speeds, but basically you troubleshoot the transmission the same way. One thing you notice on all three makes is that the new Powerflite transmission has no clutch pedal nor conventional clutch. The transmission is fully automatic. Basically, Powerflite consists of a torque converter, a multiple disc clutch, and a planetary gear system. It provides 2 forward speeds and reverse. The transmission works hydraulically to handle all necessary shifting completely automatically. Practically all driving is done in the D, or drive range. The transmission automatically upshifts from the starting ratio to direct drive as the car speed increases.
There is the low range for use in mountain driving. In that range, the transmission doesn't upshift.
That's right. It's just a single 1.7 to 1 ratio for hard pulling and for braking in hilly country.
What about oil pressure for hydraulic shifting?
Well, this unit has its own oil system. 2 oil pumps and a series of valves direct the oil to the right units at the right time. And that oil system does 2 jobs. First, it provides oil pressure to operate the internal units in response to a combination of car speeds and throttle openings. And second, it lubricates the transmission parts.
Before you get buried in oil, Jim, why don't you give the boys a rundown on how the car is driven?
Good idea, Tech. And then I can explain how we check oil level and adjustments. All normal forward starts are made in drive range, which combines a 2.6 to 1 torque converter ratio and a 1.72 to 1 gear ratio for fast acceleration. As the car picks up speed, the transmission smoothly shifts into direct drive at the proper time. It's a fully automatic power shift. That means the shift is made under power without any effort by the driver. When cruising in direct drive at speeds below approximately 45 miles an hour, instant acceleration is available to the driver for quick, safe passing. All he does is press the accelerator to the floorboard. That kick-down action causes the transmission to downshift, bringing the 1.72 to 1 gear ratio back into operation.
I get it. Now, suppose a new driver gets in the car. What does he do first?
Well, first of all, the driver puts the selector lever in neutral. Then he depresses the accelerator pedals slightly and starts the engine. As a safety precaution, the starting motor is wired through a neutral switch on the transmission, so the engine can't be started unless the selector lever is in neutral. Then the driver puts the selector lever in drive position. As soon as he presses down on the accelerator, he's on his way.
When's the upshift on this Chrysler take place?
Anywhere from a speed of 15 to 75 miles an hour, Don, depending on how that accelerator is depressed. For example, if accelerator pedal pressure is light, the upshift will take place at 15 to 20 miles an hour. But if accelerator pressure is heavy, as with a wide open throttle, the upshift will then take place at 60 to 75 miles an hour. Incidentally, the selector lever movement is controlled by a slotted steel collar. It's called a gate, attached to the lower end of the steering column. The lower slot in the gate provides stops for the low and reverse positions. The upper slot provides stops for the neutral and drive positions.
Good stopping point on that description, Jim. Now, how about getting into the troubleshooting story?
Okay, Tech. Checking fluid level in the transmission comes first. So, apply the handbrake and put the selector in neutral. And then, let the engine idle until normal operating temperature is reached. Now, shift the selector lever through all ranges. And then put it back to neutral and pull out the oil level indicator while the engine idles. Wipe off the indicator, insert it again, and check the oil level. That's it, Don. Right behind the right bank of cylinders on this model.
She's okay, Jim. Right up to the full mark.
That's fine. If it were low, you would add enough automatic transmission fluid, type A, through the filler tube to bring it up to that mark.
And don't use anything else, or I'll put your arm in a sling. Type A fluid has special additives to prevent foaming. Foaming causes a drop in pressure that interferes with valve and torque converter action. Type A also keeps its viscosity at high temperatures and helps the transmission shift smoothly.
Tech's right. And here's another point. Remember to check fluid level every 1,000 miles. At 20,000 miles, the drain and refill procedure you should follow is spelled out in this reference book.
Swell. I'll be sure to look it over.
Now, after checking fluid level, you take the car out and road test transmission operation. On new cars, you road test at lower car speeds, as outlined in the reference book. After the car has had a few miles on it, you can road test it thoroughly at all speeds. The Powerflite transmission, like any new unit, may need some adjustments because its parts go through a normal wearing-in process during the break-in period.
What would you look for during the road test?
Well, you'd naturally want a smooth upshift and downshift. You want instant response to throttle movement without the engine racing. If a shift is jerky or the engine flares up, you'll know adjustments should be made.
Okay, but where would you start?
Depends on what condition you're trying to correct, Don. Let's assume the shifting is rough and jerky. That usually means the linkage is out of adjustment.
Before you go into that adjustment, Jim, why don't you explain the linkage systems and what they do?
Good idea, Tech. You remember, we said the transmission is operated by hydraulic pressure through a series of valves. One valve, the manual control valve, is operated by the gear shift linkage from the bottom of the steering column.
Yeah, that manual control valve directs the flow of oil from the pumps to the proper units in the transmission for forward or reverse movement of the car.
Right. It's actually a selector valve. Now, there's linkage from the accelerator pedal up to the carburetor throttle lever. In addition, there's linkage from the carburetor throttle lever back to the transmission. That linkage connects to a throttle control lever on the transmission and operates a throttle valve in the transmission.
And that throttle valve routes oil to the transmission units to control their action in relation to the carburetor throttle opening.
I see. And I'm beginning to understand why a smooth transmission shift depends on proper adjustment of the linkage between the accelerator pedal and transmission.
That's the idea. So to get back to a case of a rough or jerky shift, let's go over the linkage adjustments that have to be checked. The first thing to do is disconnect the rear gear shift control rod at the bell crank mounted on the inside of the frame side rail. Then, move the manual control valve lever on the transmission to neutral. That's the second detent position from the rear of the car. Now, the upper or long lever of the bell crank should be at a 40 to 45 degree angle from vertical and toward the rear of the car.
Why is that important, Jim?
Well, Lefty, if that angle isn't right, you won't get proper travel of the manual control valve when you shift to the different positions. Now, if you didn't find it at that angle, chances are the pointer wouldn't line up either. In a case like that, you'd have to disconnect the front gear shift control rod at the bell crank. And then you'd have to hold the bell crank upper lever at 40 to 45 degrees and adjust the swivel on the rear gear shift control rod to get a free fit in the bell crank lower lever. Then reinstall the rod. Now, have someone hold the selector lever pointer in neutral position, right in the center of the letter N. Then adjust the front gear shift rod swivel to the proper position for a free fit to the upper lever of the bell crank, and reinstall the rod.
Well, that's that. Now, if someone will turn the record over, we'll get on with the next adjustment.
Okay, now what?
Well, now we check the clearance of the gear shift tube lever at the gate. It's very important because it controls the travel of the manual control valve. If it's wrong, you'll have trouble getting into the different speed positions. To check the lever travel, put the selector lever in the neutral position so the pointer is in the center of the letter N on the dial at the top of the steering column. There should be 15 to 17 thousandths clearance between the neutral stop land on the gear shift tube lever gate and the edge of the gear shift tube lever. At the same time, see that there is 15 to 30 thousandths clearance between the gate and wide, flat face part of the lever.
How do you make it right if you don't get that clearance?
Why, you adjust it by loosening those 3 attaching screws at the gear shift tube lever gate. And then move the gate to get the right clearance and tighten the screws.
Yeah, those screw holes are enlarged so you can make that adjustment.
When you've finished, operate the selector lever through all indicator positions. Check the pointer positions on the dial.
That pointer's right in the middle of each letter.
That's fine, Don. But if that linkage doesn't operate properly, or the pointer doesn't indicate correctly, don't you dare force that linkage. If you do, you'll bend the linkage, and then you'll never get it right.
Tech's right. If the pointer doesn't come to rest at the center of the letter, you'll have to recheck the linkage.
Okay. What check should we make next?
Transmission throttle pressure and the transmission throttle linkage adjustment checks are next, fellas. They're mighty important to Powerflite operation, and so is that accelerator pedal travel.
Why is that pedal travel important?
If the accelerator pedal is set too high, it's going to cramp the driver's foot. And if it's set too low, it won't operate the kickdown and won't provide enough travel for wide-open throttle operation.
I see, Tech. How do you check it?
When the accelerator pedal is pressed to the floor for wide-open throttle position, the underside of the pedal should touch the floor mat, but not compress the mat.
If you have to adjust the linkage to get that proper pedal travel, you adjust the carburetor throttle rod by turning the ball joint on the accelerator shaft to carburetor rod. Then work the linkage to see that it's free from binding. In addition, check to see if the opening of the kickdown valve in the transmission can be felt just before wide open throttle.
Okay. I think we've got her now.
All right. Now to check throttle pressure, apply the handbrake securely. And then with an electric tachometer hooked up to the engine, put the selector lever in neutral and adjust the engine idle. Turn that idle adjusting screw on the carburetor to give 475 to 500 RPM. And then shut off the ignition. Now, remove the throttle oil pressure takeoff plug located between the reverse and kick-down servos on the right side of the transmission. And in its place, connect this 100-pound pressure gauge. Start the engine, shift the selector lever to drive range, and make sure the handbrake's firmly set. Disconnect the throttle linkage at the transmission throttle control lever and work that lever back and forth several times by hand. Pressure should rise and fall as that lever is moved.
All okay so far, Jim.
Good. Now, position the throttle control lever so it's about 30 degrees toward the front of the car from a right angle to the center line of the transmission. You'll feel a slight resistance at this point. And you should read 13 to 15 pounds. If the pressure's too high, you'll get a clunk during a shift. If the pressure's too low, the engine will race or flare up as you accelerate from slow speed.
How do you adjust throttle pressure, Jim?
Well, you remove the throttle valve adjusting screw plug. About a quart of fluid will drain out. Then use this throttle adjusting screw wrench to set the throttle pressure at 14 pounds. Turn the screw counterclockwise to increase pressure, clockwise to decrease pressure. Reinstall the plug and torque it from 20 to 25 foot-pounds. Add oil to replace the oil that drained out when you remove the plug. And next, you reconnect the throttle linkage. To check this throttle linkage adjustment, pull slightly on the underside of the accelerator pedal lever from underneath the car to get a foot pressure effect on the accelerator. The throttle pressure should read 13 to 15 pounds and rise immediately when the accelerator pedal is depressed. If it doesn't, the engine may race and the shifts won't occur at proper car speeds.
This pressure is okay, but what would you do if it didn't rise?
Why, if you didn't get that immediate rise in pressure, you'd have to adjust the transmission throttle linkage. So you'd disconnect the throttle control rod swivel from the lever. Move the throttle valve lever as far forward as it'll go, and then slowly move the lever rearward until you notice a slight resistance to travel. Now, at that point, and with very slight additional lever travel, the throttle oil pressure should suddenly increase. So hold the lever at the exact position where you felt that slight resistance to travel and reconnect the rod and swivel. If the swivel will not fit into the lever, loosen the lock screw and slide the swivel on the rod until it will fit. Push the throttle rod slightly forward to remove free play in the connections. Then, holding the lever at the point where the pressure is just about to increase, tighten the lock screw.
Don't forget to recheck that throttle linkage adjustment by working the accelerator pedal with your hand.
Right. You should get 13 to 15 pounds pressure at idle and an immediate increase when the pedal's depressed the least bit.
Well, our throttle linkage adjustment is okay, Jim.
Fine, Don. So remove the pressure gauge, reinstall the takeoff plug, and torque it 10 to 12 foot-pounds.
What's the next important check, Jim?
Well, if the road test showed that the engine speed was too high when starting off or accelerating before the transmission had upshifted, you should check the kickdown band adjustment. So hook up the tachometer, start the engine, and move the selector to drive position. Apply the hand and foot brakes. Increase engine speed and watch the tachometer. At wide open throttle, the engine should reach a speed between 1450 and 1550 RPM, but no higher. If the engine speed does go higher, it could be due to a slipping kickdown band.
Don't hold that wide open throttle more than a few seconds, or you'll overheat the transmission.
Suppose the kickdown band was slipping. How would you adjust it?
Well, with the ignition off, you'd remove the accelerator pedal from the hinge section and remove the floor mat and band adjusting hole cover. Using this tool, loosen the adjusting screw lock nut. Check the fit of the adjusting screw by turning it with your fingers. It should turn freely without any binding of the threads.
If the screw is tight in the threads, replace it.
If it's free, you just tighten the kickdown band adjusting screw to 60 to 72 inch-pounds torque. Next, you use this tool again and back the adjusting screw out exactly 3 turns, as indicated by the counter on the tool. Then, holding the adjusting screw stationary with the short handle, tighten the lock nut securely.
Making the band adjustment correctly is mighty important. If it's too loose, the kickdown will be rough and jerky. If it's too tight, the band lining might burn out.
Good point, Tech. Now, fellas, if the engine races when you back up, it could indicate that the reverse band needs adjusting. You'll find a procedure for that in the reference book. Now, suppose we road test this car and check the adjustments that you fellas made.
Well, this job is as smooth as you'll ever want, Jim. Guess we'd better give Don and Lefty a couple of gold stars.
Yeah, they sure did a good job, all right. And it's a mighty good sign. After all, we're introducing the best automatic transmission to the driving public. So it's certainly our job to see that it's properly adjusted right at the beginning.
If all the mechanics follow your checking and adjustment tips carefully, Jim, the new Powerflite transmission will deliver thousands of miles of trouble-free performance. And remember, good service is what keeps owners happy and builds confidence in you and your dealership.